Welcome to the 30 Years' War. That is the new Cold War, the Clinton years. This talk is about the history of these wars. This talk is not about their morality. However, you are welcome to discuss their moral implications. My thesis is that the history of the new Cold War fits within a framework that I call practical realism. That is realism, that countries pursue power and wealth with the ultimate goal of hegemony, but realism as it is actually practiced. That is realism influenced by the self-interests of the elite. From a realist perspective, Bill Clinton was one of the most successful U.S. presidents. Clinton facilitated remarkable gains in U.S. strategic and economic power at very minimal cost, to the U.S. that is. I know some of you are thinking, Bill Clinton, a realist? You may surprise yourself. Try this quiz. Here's a matching question. Draw lines that match these realist doctrines with this list of conflicts. Each conflict matches with 3 doctrines. Time's up. Mark your own work. Haiti. First off, of course, the Monroe Doctrine. The leftist President Aristide had been overthrown by a Bush-supported coup. How could Clinton solve his dilemma? Keep his election promise of returning Aristide and still continue the economic subjugation of Haiti? Any ideas? With the deft hand of the master triangulator, Clinton invaded Haiti to reinstall Aristide, and at the same time supported the right-wing leaders, including Emmanuel Constant and his FRAP death squads. In this way, Clinton could speak softly and carry a big stick. Aristide was forced to suspend his redistributive economic policies and adopt the preferred U.S. economic model called neoliberalism. For example, Aristide was forced to allow imports of subsidized rice and chicken parts from the U.S., which destroyed Haitian agriculture, made Haiti more dependent on U.S. food imports, and added more workers for the Western-dominated factories.
The United States has followed a policy until the last year or so we started rethinking it, that we rich countries that produce a lot of food should sell it to poor countries and relieve them of the burden of producing their own food. So thank goodness they can leap directly into the industrial era. It has not worked. It's maybe been good for some of my farmers in Arkansas, but it has not worked. It was a mistake. It was a mistake that I was a party to. I am not pointing the finger at anybody. I did that. I have to live every day with the consequences of the lost capacity to produce a rice crop in Haiti to feed those people because of what I did. Nobody else.
Of course, Clinton was being too modest. This was not a mistake. It was wise, realist policy. And interestingly, from a practical realist perspective, one of the Arkansas farmers who benefited was Tyson Foods, who had returned a 10,000% profit on an investment by the former First Lady of Arkansas, Hillary Clinton. For the last doctrine, here's a hint. The windward passage between Haiti and Guantanamo Bay is the main sea lane from the Atlantic to the Panama Canal. This would, of course, match with Mahan. Iraq, closest match? The Carter Doctrine. Iraq is in the Rimland and had military ties with the former USSR and Russia, which, like the US, supported both sides in the Iran-Iraq War. So we can also match the Truman Doctrine. Iraq had a socialist economic policy was not compliant with US oil pricing and was planning to sell oil in the euro. So 1 mark for the ubiquitous neoliberalism and the Washington Consensus. Clinton's bombings, averaging 3 times a week, and sanctions crippled Iraq's society, economy, and power, at considerably less cost to the US than the George Bush invasions. Though the cost in Iraqi lives, 1 million each, was about the same. This price, however, is not a realist consideration, as related by Madeleine Albright, who here assesses the price of the bombing and sanction campaign against Iraq.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
And let's not forget practical realism. A president can never forget about domestic politics. Do you recall the grounds for impeachment? The accusation he had lied to Congress regarding his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. Double trouble. He had 2 shaky cases, one for war and one against impeachment. From a realist perspective, Clinton's Russia policy ranks as one of history's greatest victories for the least cost. Can anyone think of a higher gain-to-loss ratio in history? But first of all, what 2 doctrines were primarily involved in Clinton's shock therapy? For 2 marks, the Truman Doctrine, containing Russia, and neoliberalism. This victory was accomplished with the aid of 2 Russian leaders who did not follow basic realist principles and let Russian power decline. The first had forsaken realism for idealism. For 1 bonus mark, Mikhail Gorbachev, who even managed to survive a realist coup. And the other forsook realism for self-interest and vodka. The surprisingly resilient Boris Yeltsin. The Russian parliament had revolted against Yeltsin's neoliberal policies and his decree of authoritarian rule. In response, Yeltsin attacked the parliament, killing well over 100 people to regain his power. This was hailed in the West as democracy prevailing over communist dead-enders. And what doctrine was fulfilled by the shocks to Russia's economic and industrial base, and hence to Russian sea power? Mahan. Here's a good summary from the Atlantic magazine. The year was 1996. Boris Yeltsin was seeking a second term, and Bill Clinton desperately wanted to help. "I want this guy to win so bad," he told Deputy Secretary of State Strobe Talbot. "It hurts." Clinton liked Yeltsin personally. He considered him Russia's best hope for embracing democracy and capitalism, and he appreciated Yeltsin's acquiescence during NATO's march eastward into the former Soviet bloc. Unfortunately for Clinton, ordinary Russians appreciated their leader far less. Yeltsin's shock therapy economic reforms had reduced the government's safety net and produced a spike in unemployment and inflation. Between 1990 and 1994, the average life expectancy among Russian men had dropped by an astonishing 6 years. When Yeltsin began his re-election campaign in January 1996, his approval rating stood at 6%, lower than Stalin's. So the Clinton administration sprang into action. It lobbied the International Monetary Fund to give Russia a $10 billion loan, some of which Yeltsin distributed to woo voters. Upon arriving in a given city, he often announced, "My pockets are full." 3 American political consultants, including Richard Dresner, a veteran of Clinton's campaign in Arkansas, went to work on Yeltsin's re-election bid. Every week, Dresner sent the White House the Yeltsin campaign's internal polling. And before traveling to meet Yeltsin in April, Clinton asked Dresner what he should say in Moscow to boost his buddy's campaign. It worked. In a stunning turnaround, Yeltsin, who had begun the campaign in last place, defeated his communist rival in the election's final round by 13 percentage points. Talbot declared that a number of international observers have judged this to be a free and fair election. But Michael Meadowcroft, a Brit who led the election observer team of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, later claimed there had been widespread voter fraud, which he had been pressured not to expose. In Chechnya, which international observers believed contained fewer than 500,000 adults, 1 million people voted, and Yeltsin, despite prosecuting a brutal war in that region, won exactly 70%. They'd been bombed out of existence, and there they were all supposedly voting for Yeltsin, exclaimed Meadowcroft. It's like what happened in Cameroon. Thomas Graham, who served as the chief political analyst at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow during the campaign, later conceded that Clinton officials knew the election wasn't truly fair. This was a classic case, he admitted, of the ends justifying the means. What do you think? Did Clinton accomplish the greatest destruction of an adversary without the use of warfare in the history of great power conflict? In 1991, Paul Kagame and the RPF, with Anglo-American support, invaded Rwanda.
By the early 90s, Paul Kagame commanded the RPF. They invaded Rwanda and fought a guerrilla war, eventually taking over a large swathe of the north. The largely Tutsi RPF threatened to take the capital. 1 million Hutus fled from their homes.
Then in 1997, again with Anglo-American support, they invaded Congo and deposed Mobutu Sese Seko.
5 million people dead, some shot, some tortured to death, many others who died of starvation. Now, this is the first time that any international body has tried to pull all that information together. What the UN Human Rights Organization has done is chronicle more than 600 of the worst atrocities. Now, these atrocities were committed by many different forces, Ugandans, Congolese, Angolans, but they have singled out the Rwandans, it seems, for the most criticism. And what they have suggested is that the Rwandan army, that's the army of the current Rwandan government, heavily backed by the British government, this government, they say, sent its forces into Congo, and they may have committed acts of genocide.
Now here's a trick question. The doctrine the Anglo-Americans were following is one we haven't discussed. It is a 19th century European doctrine. Here's another hint. France's neo-colonial policy of Francafrique in Rwanda and Congo was tolerated during the Cold War, but not after the fall of the USSR. One more hint. Boutros Ghali said of the Rwanda and Congo invasions, "Is this not a repetition of Fashoda?" That is, the Anglo-French conflict over Sudan in 1898. For one mark, the best match realist doctrine is, I said this was a trick question, the scramble for Africa. This may also have been a way to help contain Russia and China in Africa, so the Truman Doctrine. And it was especially profitable to Western mining interests, thus neoliberalism. As geopoliticians are wont to say, a brief glance at the map is all you need to understand what geopolitical doctrine was behind the Yugoslav wars of the 90s. What do you think? Pretty obvious? For 1 mark? The Truman Doctrine, containing Russia, reducing its strategic depth. The Clinton-Balkan Wars were the first time since World War I that military force successfully rolled back Russian influence in its European near abroad. This letter to the German Chancellor describes the U.S. strategic reasons for the wars on Yugoslavia as outlined in a conference put on by the U.S. State Department. I assume you read German. However, the print was too small, so I have translated the points in larger print. The European legal order presents an obstacle to carrying out the plans of NATO. In this sense, the American legal system is more suitable for application in Europe. American troops must be stationed there in order to compensate for the missed opportunity from 1945. This is U.S. Camp Bondsteel in Kosovo. Represented a precedent to be invoked by anyone at any time, and that many others will follow the example in the future. Prescient indeed. It would be good during NATO's current enlargement to restore the territorial situation in the area between the Baltic Sea and Anatolia such as existed during the Roman Empire. And of course, to have this isthmus controlled by NATO. Part of Spikeman's Rimland. Romania and Bulgaria are to secure a land connection to Turkey. The claim that during its attack on the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, NATO violated all international rules, and especially all the relevant provisions of international law, was not disputed. A fine example of realism as found anywhere in Thucydides. Willy Wimmer added his own summary. It seems that the American side, for the sake of its own goals, is willing and ready to undermine on a global scale the international legal order, which came about as a result of the 2 world wars in the previous century. Force is to stand above law. Wherever international law stands in the way, it is to be removed. With friendly regards, Willy Wimmer, member, German Bundestag, and Vice President Parliamentary Assembly, OSCE. Herr Wimmer seemed surprised. Perhaps he had not read his Bismarck, Clausewitz, or Thucydides. Justice, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Another cause can be discerned in this speech by Serbian President Milosevic. What word in it would offend the West?
Demokratsko društvo pogotovo ne bi smeo da dopusti da se ljudi dele nacionalno I verski. Jedine razlike koje se u socijalizmu...
Socialism. And the counter-realist doctrine is neoliberalism. The main objective of the NATO intervention was to integrate the former Republic of Yugoslavia into the Western neoliberal social and economic system, Noam Chomsky. It was Yugoslavia's resistance to the broader trends of political and economic reform, not the plight of Kosovar Albanians, that best explains NATO's war. Strobe Talbot approved this message, Clinton's Deputy Secretary of State. Another brief look at the map shows how the Balkan Wars could help contain Russian naval power in the Mediterranean region, hence fulfilling whose doctrine? Mahan. Was political self-interest a factor? The Independent and Christopher Hitchens were not alone in thinking so. Welcome to Wag the Dog 3. Number 3. Bombing Kosovo has the appeal of eradicating Monica from the public mind. NATO bombing failed to force an end to the conflict in Kosovo. It was Russian diplomacy that convinced Slobodan Milosevic to withdraw his little-damaged security forces from the region. Canadian General Louis Mackenzie. The bombing campaign was not working and had to switch from military to civilian targets. And so, a dozen newspapers featured cartoons that read, "Ask me about Monica."